Hello again, Year 7. Today we're going to be looking at Lesson 7 of the reproduction topic, Fertilisation and Germination in Plants. You can find further information in Activate Book 1, pages 52 to 53, and if you're following this on the PowerPoint, you can also find it in Wolf Hall Physics Fertilisation and Germination video. Okay, so today, two simple objectives. Firstly, you should be able to describe the process of fertilisation in plants. And secondly, you should be able to describe how seeds and fruits are formed. Before we do that, however, let's just have a little recap of what we did last lesson. Remember, we learned about the different parts of a flower and what their jobs were. So without writing anything down, just take a look at the statements on the left. They are the functions or jobs of the various parts. On the right hand side, you've got 4 parts. Just give yourself a moment or two and see if you can link up those in your head. You might want to pause the video while you do that. Okay, let's see how we got on then. Firstly, protects the flower bud. That will be the sepals. Now the sepals, if you ever buy roses or seen roses which just haven't quite blossomed, you'll see that they're surrounded by sort of green petal-like structure, and they open up and then support the main flower underneath. They're the sepals. Produces pollen grains. Well, if you remember, pollen is the male sex cell equivalent to sperm in animals, and therefore produced by the male part of the cell. So do you remember how you remember that? It's stamen, men is male, so that represents the male part of the flower. Colourful part that attracts insects, hopefully you'd have no problem with that. There would be the petals. And finally, produces the ovule or eggs, the female sex cell. That would be the carpel. Okay, onwards to fertilisation. So just like in animals, the male sex cell has to meet the female sex cell in order for a new life to form, and plants are no different. The male sex cell, of course, is the pollen grain. And the first part of fertilisation is that the pollen grain from usually a different plant must land and encounter a second plant. And it normally, well it does, land on the so-called sticky stigma, like so. Now, as soon as it lands on there, it then starts to grow what we call a pollen tube. And that pollen tube gets longer and longer and longer until it reaches an ovule in the ovary, the ovule being the female sex cell. Now, just like in animals, in order for fertilisation to occur, it's the nucleus of that sex cell which joins with the nucleus of the female sex cell. When that occurs, we have fertilisation. And once fertilisation has occurred, a seed will then form within that plant. Okay, so again, fertilisation in plants are very similar to what we have in animals. Male sex cell meets female sex cell, only here it's pollen meets ovule. Okay, the exercise I'd like you to have a go at now is a little bit tricky, and the instructions at the top are in fact incorrect. If we start with this statement here, first of all, it's a list of statements which describe how pollination occurs, the story of pollination. And I'd like you all to start with this statement here. A bee visits a flower to feed on nectar. The bee wriggles deep into the flower past the anthers. I'd like you to start with that statement there, and then look for the next statement, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, until you get to this last one here, the fertilized egg develops into a seed. So I've given you the first and the last ones there. Can you put the others in sequence so we get that story of pollination? So again, you should pause the video, write it out in rough first again maybe, and then once you've done that, come back and check the solutions with me in a moment. Okay, so if you'd like to pause the video now. Okay, as I said before, that was quite tricky. So the first statement I gave to you, a bee visits a flower to feed on nectar. That's that sugary substance which most insects like. The bee wriggles deep into the flower past the anthers. So cunningly, The nectar is deep inside the flower, so the insect has to brush past the anthers to do that. As the bee passes the anthers, pollen grains stick to the hairs of the bee's body. So the grains, if they're spiky in particular, could stick in the fur of the bee. The bee then flies to another flower, carrying pollen from the first flower with it. Okay, so one flower here is pollinating another flower. The bee feeds on the nectar in the second flower, so it's attracted to that second flower again by the nectar in that flower. But this time, pollen grains from the bee get stuck on the stigma. So pollen grains from the first plant are now transferred to the sticky stigma of the second. Pollen grain, as we described earlier, develops a pollen tube that grows down the style towards the ovule. The pollen grain nucleus joins the egg or ovule nucleus, and then the last statement I gave to you, the fertilized egg develops into a seed. It's quite important that you understand that sequence of events there. It's all about how the pollen from one plant can be transferred to firstly the stigma of a second one, and then eventually to the ovules of that second plant, where fertilization takes place and a seed can develop. Okay, the next stage in the process is when the seed starts to grow, and the process while it's growing is called germination. I suppose it's a little bit like gestation in an animal, where the egg cell turns into an embryo and ultimately a fetus. Well, the same sort of thing happens with the seed. It develops from the seed to a seedling, eventually to a plant. Now, in order to do that, it needs certain things. It firstly needs water. This will allow the seed to swell up and the embryo inside to start growing. Oxygen is then used for respiration. So again, like animals, respiration needs to take place, the conversion of food into energy. And warmth is required as well. This will help to speed up reactions within the plant itself. Now, in terms of what you need to know for your books, folks, you need to know what germination means, the process of the seed growing, and you also need to know what factors affect how quickly germination will take place. So if you could make a copy of that into your notes, that will do nicely. Pause the video for 5-10 minutes or so while you do that. This is one of the experiments that we would have done had you been in school with us. I'll leave you to read the method. It's also, as well as getting an understanding of the effects of germination, what affects germination I should say, it also gives you a little practice about identifying variables, etc. So you might want to have a little read of the method and then try and identify the independent, dependent and control variables in that particular experiment. But if you've got seeds available, cress seeds work really well with this, then why not have a go at home yourself? It only takes a matter of about 3, 4, 5 days for you to see results. Okay, so you can do that in a cup. It doesn't have to be a beaker. You don't have to use 20 seeds. You can use whatever you've got available there. Okay, so I'll leave you to have a go at that. Hopefully you have a bit of fun doing it. If you wanted to do this more scientifically, you could actually count up the number of seeds which have germinated with the different volumes of water and then calculate a percentage as shown on the slide there. You could then of course have a go answering the question or conclusion, does the amount of water affect the number of seeds that have germinated? Explain your answer. Okay, so why not have a go at that? Okay, so by now then you should be able to tell me how fertilization occurs in plants, and you should also be able to describe the process of germination and the factors that affect germination.